Welcome to the PME presentation on wargaming. I'm joined by some visitors from outside of RMC. So I've got Lieutenant Colonel Jenkinson from the Australian Defence Academy. Also got Sergeant Casey from across the road at the Academy, and also Todd Mason from the DSTG, who is also the convener of the Australian Connections Conference. So the purpose of this presentation, as it says, is to basically raise awareness of the utility of wargaming as a learning tool. What I'll quickly go through is a very short introduction and history on wargaming, talk about what wargaming is, then a few words about chance and how that is often simulated in wargaming. Talk about how you select an appropriate wargame. We'll also talk about what our partners in the ABCA are doing in the wargaming space. I'll have some resources that if you wish to follow up and do your own investigation. There are a list of websites, and also outside after the presentation there are a number of examples of games that you can have a look at. I also have a takeaway pack which has got examples of the games that you can take away with you, which you can look at and play at your leisure. Right, so to start off, a very quick introduction. So can anybody tell me what the relevance might be of these two books to the subject that I'm going to be talking about? Science fiction and imagination, yep. Anything about the authors? All right, it might surprise you to discover that H.G. Wells and Fred Jane were both wargamers. And in fact, H.G. Wells wrote the book Little Wars, which was basically a set of rules to stop basically playing with toy soldiers and getting a little bit more rigour in the rules of how to play model soldiers. In your room, the top right image there, the gentleman with the watch with the bushy moustache is in fact H.G. Wells supervising two of his friends participating in a game in his house. Below you can see Fred Jane's naval war game. So Fred Jane actually wrote a set of war games for naval conflict. That set of rules required data, so he wrote some data for the German fleet and the British fleet. That was a separate book. It had all the details about armoured plating, the weapons that were on the ships, etc., which you needed to know to play the war game. Obviously that over time turned into the Janes that many of us know as, you know, the Janes reference books. But that's where their genesis came from, and the image on the bottom of the slide is the game being played by members of the Royal Navy as a form of PME. One of the very first professional war games that was used by the military was a game called Kriegspiel, which loosely translated in German means war game. It came out of the post-period of the defeat of the Prussian army by Napoleon's armies, where the Prussian senior officers had sort of rested on their laurels. They had not changed with the times. They had not looked at how Napoleon was conducting warfare, and as a consequence they suffered a significant defeat in the Battle of Jena. A few years later, they went through a reformation process where they looked at what had gone wrong, and one of the things that came out of that process was that a lot of the young officers realised things needed to change. Part of that included the development of this game, or Kriegspiel. It was created in 1812. It was part of that both physical and intellectual re-examination of the Prussian army. That, as I said, had sort of rested on its laurels and hadn't modernised. It was developed by Lieutenant George Leopold von Rieswitz and named Instructions for the Representation of Tactical Manoeuvres under the guise of a war game, and consisted of a table, counters, a set of rules. When it was presented to Baron von Muffling, as you can see from the quote there, he was so taken with it that he realised it wasn't a game, it was in fact an instructional tool, and it was institutionalised in the Prussian army. It was one of the factors that led to the Prussian army becoming such a successful army. And during the Franco-Prussian War in 1870 to 71, the previous disasters that the Prussians had was reversed. They defeated the French to the point that other armies around the world, particularly the United Kingdom and others in Europe, looked to what Prussia was doing, and they created their own version of Kriegspiel. Right, so this is the genesis of more serious wargaming. So a little bit closer to home, shouldn't come as a surprise to any of you that a young Lieutenant Monash, whilst a subaltern, made a recommendation of a number of things that need to be done in training, one of which was wargaming, which he listed as a principal professional development activity that would be conducted in the Navy and Military Club and the United Services Institute of Victoria. I haven't been able to confirm whether they were using the British Kriegspiel rules, but they were certainly around at the time. But there were also other rule sets, and the book, The Defence of Duffer's Drift, as another example of a type of wargame which basically set you a problem, you determine what you thought was the solution to the problem, and then you read on to actually find out what happened to the Duffer at Duffer's Drift. And as you went through the book, the solutions that he came up with more and more improved, and he was more successful. So let's advance now to a scholastic view. This is a quote from Dr. Hurst, as you can see, in the War Studies Department at King's College in London. I have highlighted the piece that I think is important for us at the Royal Military College, being new possibilities and challenges to our teaching and learning practices. All right. So they actually have formal courses that are delivered there, both in their history department and in the Department of War Studies, where they actually utilise historical war games to assist the students to learn about the subject matter of the course. That was pretty much institutionalised by Professor Phil Sabin. So for the last sort of 5 or so years, the US and the UK have recognised the benefits of wargaming and have strove to reinvigorate wargaming, acknowledging how it helps to develop critical thinking and exercises decision making in a safe to fail environment. So the US Deputy Secretary of Defence in 2015 actually issued a minute, or correction, a memo, directing that the US Department of Defence, and particularly Army, was to look at reinvigorating the use of wargaming, and that was all types of wargaming, not just computer simulation, and they have been doing that now for a number of years. Same thing has been occurring in the United Kingdom, probably not at the same pace, but they are using both manual wargaming and simulations in their schools, and they have actually put out formal wargaming doctrine, which is freely available on the web, and I do have a link to it if you're interested in downloading that document that talks about how to go about wargaming. Unfortunately, to date, we are not probably doing quite as well. We do have a strong emphasis on computer simulation for wargaming. You would all be aware of the battle simulation sites that are available to the brigades, but they tend to be underutilised or predominantly used for command post exercises. Although the last time I spoke to the operators that were managing the BSS in Brisbane, they said that there had been an increase in uptake in the use of the facility, which was good to hear. That was only a couple of weeks ago. So, what is a war game? So a lot of people, when they, in the military at least, when you talk about wargaming, you think about Koa wargaming. All right, yeah, that is a form of wargaming. But what wargaming is not, which I'll go through in a moment, all right, are some things that I have seen purported as being wargames. So this definition is one that has been created by one of the officers in the British Army. It's based on Peter Perler's definition of wargaming. The key takeaways, the things that define what is a wargame, if it doesn't have these criteria, it does not probably meet the threshold of being a wargame. So it's got to be adversarial, right? There has to be conflict within the game. Right? It will use some form of rules, there'll be data, and there'll be processes and procedures that will govern how the game, all right, is undertaken. And the game will shape and is shaped by the decisions undertaken by the participants. All right? So if you're doing a war game, but it doesn't have one of those things in there, I would challenge you and say you are perhaps not, in fact, undertaking a war game as defined here. So, some common misconceptions. So, going on from what I just spoke about. So, wargaming versus Koa wargaming versus ROC, a rehearsal of concept. So, a rehearsal of concept, right? There is no conflict and there is no enemy interaction normally with a rehearsal of concept, right? You already have a plan and you are rehearsing or going through the steps of that plan. A ROC is not a war game. Right. Koa wargaming does meet the definition that I put up earlier. All right. It is about conducting a war game to strengthen a plan. You have developed a plan using the military appreciation process, right, and then you use wargaming to make that plan better, all right, or to find where there are weaknesses. And to do that, you need a good red player, somebody who is the enemy, who challenges, all right, your thoughts on what you believe the enemy was going to do, which is part of your analysis that enabled you to arrive at your plan. And sometimes with a good red player, you will find there are lots of weaknesses that you need to fix up. Now, if you're a platoon commander, that can be your platoon sergeant, and you go through your plan with your platoon sergeant. Okay, as a company commander, it could be with your CSM, your 2IC, right? At a staff level, it's normally done, right, with the intelligence staff as the red and the ops staff normally as blue, coordinated by the chief of staff, all right, and directed by the commander to wargame certain elements of various plans before arriving at the final plan and then issuing orders. A couple other misconceptions. So gaming. So gaming's not serious. There is a lot of gaming now being done outside the military, which is used for learning. There are some examples that you will see outside which fit the definition of a war game, which I've played myself, which enable you to learn. Having seen some presentations from people from organisations like the Victorian Ambulance Service, the New South Wales Fire Service, they all take and use some form of gaming now, okay, to learn, okay, when they deliver some of their courses, or to wargame when they're actually looking at planning. Probably all seen The Big Bang Theory. Right, those of you who haven't seen The Big Bang Theory, a bunch of nerds, they play lots of games. Again, there's this connotation that only nerds play war games. All right. The fact that wargaming is at the King's College in London, okay, a prestigious college, right, and in a number of staff colleges around the world, challenges that misconception. All right. Again, wargaming is not a learning activity. Again, if the wargaming is done well, there are lots of things that you can learn from playing a wargame. And any game that uses dice is just a game of chance. Again, I would challenge that. We'll talk about chance and dice later on, but if you understand the rationale behind the use of dice in the game and what it represents, then again, you will realise that's a misconception. If you're playing Ludo, I might agree with that, but if you're doing a war game, the use of dice, okay, is just another tool to arrive at an outcome, which I'll discuss in a minute. So why? Why should we be wargaming? Right, so we used to do this quite often back in the 80s. The reason why is up there on the slide. So it's all about giving people the opportunity to practice decision making, right? But to do it in a way that is safe. So if they want to do some funky left flank attack, that a DS, if they were at the College of Knowledge, would turn around and say, no, that is not in accordance with doctrine, they can still do that using a war game, and you can then learn from doing it and determine whether in fact actually that plan would work with modification, or no, that's really not a good idea. Right? It enables you to appreciate risk. Right? It enables you to exploit your imagination. So we spoke about science fiction. There are science fiction war games, right, that are out there. And there are people that use games again to exploit your imagination. It enables you to understand competition and adversarial thinking. All right. When you do these in a team environment, it enables you to get to know the strengths and weaknesses of members of your team, okay, whether that's a staff or whether it's a branch, etc., okay, or just the platoon sergeant and the platoon commander working together, platoon headquarters. All right. You can learn from defeat. This is from the Israeli Defence Force. They actually have activities in their training that leads to the trainee being defeated, because you can learn from being defeated. Right? Many, many years ago, I was told, in an auditorium a bit larger than this, how many of you had been killed off by the DS during a live fire exercise, and almost all of us put our hand up, and the person giving the presentation turned around and said, "You have all been taught to die." And we're all taken aback, not quite sure what he was getting at. His point was that if you tell somebody when you are shot, you are dead, and that is the expected outcome in your mind, all right, you are starting to psychologically tell yourself, if I get shot, I'm going to die. Rather than what we should be doing is telling them, hey, if you've been shot, crawl to cover if you can, apply self-aid, get back in the fight, because that's the fighting mentality we want in our soldiers. So, interesting little analogy. And again, through playing war games, you can gain insights. They are all examples of various rules that are available, that can be purchased or found on the web. The Command and Staff College one there is a very old set of rules that was previously used back in the day when we still had Headquarters Training Command, and that was from the Wargaming Centre that was part of Headquarters Training Command. So this is not new, it's just a skill that has probably atrophied over time in the Australian Army. Types of war games, so you've got digital and computer assisted war games, map war games, board war games. those that have been self-designed or a commercial off-the-shelf game. There are a number of those that are out there that you'll see after this presentation. There are those for command, decision and planning. There are what are called sand table war games. So again, there is an example of that called Up the Guts, which Ty can talk to. Right? And then there are also soft issue games like matrix games and role-playing. And Todd has got some stuff set up outside as well, and he can talk about matrix gaming. I've got very limited exposure, but I have played ISIS Crisis, and I found it, again, illuminating playing that game to understand the problems of trying to defeat ISIS in Syria by playing that game. So why do I have a bias to analogue versus simulation war games? So the pros and cons are there on the slide. You can see the difference between analogue and digital. My bias is because they are simple, they're cheap. If you speak to the right person, okay, they are quite easy to make. They're portable. They're something that you can use in the unit. You don't have to go and book the sim centre. You don't need a person to program a scenario into the computer, etc. So there are some very simple tools out there that can be used in the unit, which are analogue tools, right? And as I said, there are viable commercial off-the-shelf war games that you can purchase, or the unit can purchase, that would enable you to undertake a wargaming activity, and the participants could learn from participating. All right, those of you who've ever participated in, if you've been a puckster in a computer war game, pucksters take at least a day, if not longer, to learn just to use the system itself. That is a huge disadvantage to using a simulation system. And the most of those simulation systems that I have seen, particularly in my previous job as the SO2 simulation policy at Headquarters Forces Command, the GUI, so the interface between the player and the computer simulation, is where a lot of these games fall down, because they are very complicated, they're not easy to learn, even though the people that sell them to us say they are.
So Scott Jenkinson, I've just come from 3 years instructing at the Canadian Forces College, which was postgraduate level master's program. So that's sort of my background from Canada. I'm not a gamer, I'm an educator and a problem solver, and I find wargaming is a useful tool for both of those. So in terms of the US, as Andrew said before, wargaming was really invigorated in 2015 when the Secretary of Defence put out the direction that this is how we're going to solve problems, this is how we're going to educate the force. And the services embrace that extensively. So now you'll find all of the PME colleges are using wargaming at various parts of their curriculum to bring in experiential learning, to focus on active learning, and then coupled with that after action reviews and reflection periods to bring home the lessons. In some ways, the game is actually not that important. The game provides the experience and the decision making and the failures and the successes, so you can talk about it afterwards and you can reflect on those experiences and have the after action review. So the Marine Corps is heavily invested in wargaming. They've created a number of operational games, one of which is called Assassin's Mace, which is designed to put the students through a variety of scenarios, and you're playing air, land, sea, subsurface, cyber, you name it. They've all been factored into the game. So anything you would do in operational planning has been factored into that game. The Army has included a course on designing war games. Why would you want students to design war games? Well, if you want to examine the lessons from the Falklands War, what better way to learn about it than to have to produce a simulation or a model that mimics what occurred and the decision making that had to go. So they're spending quite a bit of time putting students through this elective as part of their master's program, where you can design games to meet educational outcomes or to study particular historical situations to put back into your learning situation. The UK is going really well. Their doctrine that Andrew talked about is very, very good. It talks about all types of wargaming, whether it be course of action analysis wargaming to educational wargaming to analytical wargaming, where we have novel situations that we want to explore and we want to see how people might react in those situations. And I stress might, but it gives us something to consider and research. So that doctrine is freely available and Andrew can provide it to you. But from that, a guy by the name of Tom Mowat has been producing an extensive number of games, whether it be at the Sandhurst level, so very much similar to Royal Military College Duntroon, or all the way up to interdepartmental matrix games that are testing what various levels of the British government might do in a situation. So gaming is certainly growing within the UK staff colleges. And then Canada, where I have the most experience, Canada is also having a wargaming resurgence, not to the same level as the US or the UK, but certainly the army schools have now started to embrace wargaming as an adversarial and experiential learning technique. So there is a lot of value that they're finding at the Army Staff College. So the Army Staff College is equivalent to the Grade 2, Grade 3 AOC style courses that we have at Canungra, and at the Joint Staff College where I was teaching for operational and strategic learning. Last year we ran a Masters accredited course on wargaming for professional military education, where we went through all the different types of wargaming, from Kriegspiel to how you might run troop training in your unit, all the way through how you might do force design and force development for the Canadian Armed Forces, and that was well received. Interagency wargaming is also very big in Canada, and it's actually led by Global Affairs Canada, which is the equivalent of our DFAT. So much so that when they've got a crisis simulation or they're thinking about various contingencies, GAC will bring in the other departments, including the CAF, and will run through various games to see how people would react, what decisions might be made, what information or triggers they might need to actually get going and get moving. So there is a large body of interdepartmental, interagency wargaming going on. The universities in Canada are very content with wargaming as being part of their university courses. So political science and a number of other courses at McGill University and other universities are using serious games and wargaming as part of their educational suite of tools. Unfortunately, none of the Australian universities currently run postgraduate education in wargaming. So that's sort of the experience from ABCA, but it is gathering steam. The Marine Corps, the US Army, the UK colleges are very keen to reach out and do stuff with their ABCA partners, and they're very keen to do work with us here.
Clearly on the battlefield, we all know about the fog of war. There are random events. Vehicles break down, you have bad weather. And I think about Eisenhower having to make the decision for the D-Day landings. You know, he had about a 60% chance that he was going to have fair weather, and otherwise they were going to have to wait another couple of months before they could potentially commence the invasion. All right, but he chose to go ahead, and as we know, they were successful. They successfully lodged in Normandy and opened the new front, and ultimately that led to the defeat of Nazi Germany. But you could also have accidents. So there are random things that you may wish to have simulated in the game to put the players under pressure. Right? The best way of introducing random events, all right, is through some form of chance. It could be drawing a chance card, which has a good thing or a bad thing. All right? A bad thing might be that your next resupply is being delayed by 24 hours, and that might have implications in the game. All right? Or a good thing might be, at a tactical level, your JTAC informs you that there are 2 F-18s on station, fully bombed up, ready to go, which you weren't banking on, but now you've got 2 aircraft that you can strike the enemy with and use in your plan. All right? So you need potentially to consider the introduction of chance, which then introduces risk. And you need to have an understanding of risk. So we'll go through using the various risk tools to determine what's the likelihood, what's the impact, all right? But what's the purpose of doing all this? All right? Ultimately, it is to appreciate what you can and can't do, all right? Or whether you believe doing something is worth the risk, okay? Is the juice worth the squeeze, as the old saying goes? So that's where the role of dice comes into the game, all right? So a lot of people think about dice, it's all about chance, but I would put to you that the use of dice is more about considering risk. So, to illustrate my point, so what's the accepted combat ratio for a quick attack against a prepared position? What's the normal ratio that tends to be thrown out? What is it? 3 to 1. Correct. Righto. So what's the likelihood of success, all right, for an attack on the basis of 3 to 1? What? 82%. Any others? Depends on the situation. Yes. All right. Based on historical operational research, it's a 50% chance. Yes, circumstances can change, and I know this is not, don't get confused about mathematics. That's not what I'm talking about here. But if you were going to roll a dice and you're going to succeed on a roll of 4, 5 and 6, so I give you the dice and I go, you're the platoon commander, okay, you're attacking with 3 to 1, you've got a 50% chance of being successful, and you're going to roll the dice. So that's the analogy. Use the risk analogy for dice rather than, it's like playing Ludo, all right? So is the risk of failure acceptable? 50%, what do you reckon?
Depends on the outcomes of the action. So is the risk of your element such that the strategy is then ruined if you do fail? Or is your failure irrelevant but your success so contingent that you have to do it?
Okay, so there's straight away, those points, if you think about it as a learner, doesn't that make you start thinking and learn? And there's some stuff there that you could take away that's probably not in the pamphlet, that you have not been taught in tactics, all right? So if the answer is no, then you've got to adjust your plan, which is one of the points that you made. Yeah. So 2 things. So this is the historical minimal planning ratios. Okay, this is our doctrine. The figures that are at the top there, all right, they are in a tool that is referred to in our doctrine. It is used by CAT-C. And CTC in particular. The bottom tool is just another way it's been displayed. That's been developed by the UK equivalent of DSTG, which is DSTL. And again, it gives you an indication of at the bottom of the scale is the size of your force. The type of engagement is obviously to the left, and then you can see if you're in a meeting engagement and you have 2 times the number that your enemy has in combat power, not pure numbers, combat power, right? Then you can see you've probably got a very good chance of success. That's how that tool works, and you could use that tool then to develop rules that you could then apply in a war game, which is exactly what Major Mount in the United Kingdom in the MOD has done, and you'll see that later. So war games cover a very broad spectrum, anything from matrix games on the extreme left to computer-assisted analytical war games that are undertaken by DSTG, okay, to look at force structures, etc. So you can see the scale of creativity and understanding and where that peters out, okay, versus rigour and analytical precision that you might require. So again, you can see Coal Wargaming and Free Kriegspiel sort of sits about in the middle. All right. So again, food for thought when you start thinking about, well, what sort of war game do we need if you're looking at using a war game for learning purposes? So that brings me to selecting the right type of game. So you need to ask yourself those 2 key questions. So what is it that you're after? What is the learning outcome? Okay? What is the objective that you're trying to achieve through use of a war game or the game that you have selected? Right? And who's the learner? Who is this aimed at? You're going to have a different type of game if it's aimed at majors who are all doing the majors course versus corporals who might be doing sub 1 for sergeant. So you might want different games because there are potentially different learning outcomes that you are striving for. So you need to pick the appropriate tool, right? There are different types of games. One is an open game, which is like you can see everything. You can see what the enemy's doing, and the enemy can see what you're doing. You've got a god's eye view of the playing surface. Or there's a closed view game where you only really know where your own forces are. You only know about the enemy through the conduct of reconnaissance, surveillance, and ISR. That has friction and fog of war. You've got analog versus digital, which we already spoke about. Various examples that you'll see. But I ask you to remember the golden BB rule and test your war games. Right, perfect example of this was during a command-based exercise. I was a senior controller. An incident occurred and an entire blue company was wiped out with an indirect fire support mission by the enemy, which was just not realistic. I went over to see what the red player had done. A blue icon had popped up on his screen. He'd immediately seen the grid reference to that, which he'd recorded, put that straight into his fire data and fired a 100% accurate indirect fire mission onto that unit and destroyed it. All right. Well, we all know, using professional military judgment, that that is probably not likely unless they're using precision-guided munitions. So I had to modify the outcome, which I did. All right. And then we then made sure that that outcome went through to the training audience, so they didn't actually see that outcome. We did in HICON, and we moderated result. Because a simulation, particularly computer simulations, can give you a result right out on the right of the bell curve, the 1 in a million, and right out on the left of the bell curve, 1 in a million. And so you need to bear that in mind as well. So that's the golden BB rule. So also, when you're doing your after-action reviews, have a learned colleague there to facilitate those. So again, if you're doing it at company level, it might be the 2IC with the subbies and the platoon sergeants as the learned colleague. And as has already been mentioned, the learning actually occurs after you have played the game. It's through the reflection. So yes, the AR process, which is a formal process of reflection, but also even if it's sitting there after playing the game and beating yourself up because you got outflanked by the enemy, and you're like, why did that happen? Okay, you can learn by failure, remember? So you'd have to have that reflection. If there's no reflection, there is no point, I would put to you, in playing the war game in the first place.
Afternoon all. Ty Casey. I have been gaming now for as long as I can remember, both in the recreational and more recently, the last decade, the professional space. And I'm kind of a bridge between the two. But just firstly to talk about the Army Knowledge Centre. Lieutenant Colonel Hill is the SO1 sim there now, and he did intend on coming down today to spruik their future plans, and he apologises for not being able to attend. Obviously things in Victoria at the moment are interesting. He has drafted a decision brief which has been sent up through the chains, hopefully soon on its way to Forcom, to using the sim centres as a local hubs, establish what we're calling fight clubs, where soldiers, officers can effectively turn up at short notice and take advantage of games libraries to conduct wargaming. But also it's a place where eventually we want to seed a few analogue wargaming SMEs to be able to conduct this training on site at short notice for units, because traditionally it can be stood up a lot quicker than doing the digital stuff. I know there's a huge bias, at least amongst us, with regards to analogue versus digital. You think of it like anything else, right tool, right job, right learning outcome. So being able to have those sim centres potentially start off area hubs for a fight club which can do both, hopefully with some enthusiastic individuals and future learning as we try and create, current terms games masters, but we try and create SMEs within their own units. Then units hopefully will then establish their own fight clubs to try and make this stuff commonplace again. No time frame, it's very early stages and the plan is constantly evolving. Fortunately and unfortunately, there are multiple lines of effort from enthusiastic people around defence, and the biggest part of this brief hopefully is to grip all that up into one combined line of effort, so we can hopefully accelerate our use of wargaming within our Army and defence as well. The ADF Wargaming Association, just to talk on the next point now and spruik the recreational side. Has anyone heard of the association before? No? Okay. We've actually been around for 10 years. It started out of my garage when I was at Kapuka for the first time as an RI in 2009. And we just got some like-minded people together and started rolling dice and having a bit of fun. It was the recreational side of things, albeit even in the recreational games there's the cogs are turning, the brain's doing its thing, and there is still critical thinking involved. That grew very quickly because we found that there were a lot of closet gamers, whilst the subject was still taboo back in the day, and has now blossomed into quite a big organisation. We have around about 800 registered members, and that's growing all the time. And our main effort now is to facilitate convention level events where we host the recreational side of wargaming that includes defence members, ex-serving members and invited members of the public, where we run tournaments, run games, do the hobby side of things, and also raise a lot of money for defence charities. I think we're over $100,000 donated now, which for the amount of people that have been attending our events is quite a disproportionate sum, which is pretty good to go. We also link in because wargaming and the recreational side of things has been quite beneficial for members and ex-serving members suffering from mental health issues and that as well, giving them something to concentrate on and forcing them to get away from their Xbox potentially and actually have some interaction face-to-face with people. Very powerful, I suppose, a side benefit of wargaming. Our next event, we didn't do anything last year for obvious reasons. Our next event's actually being held here in Canberra, mid-December. We've got one of the big halls at Epic booked, where we'll be running a combination of recreational, social tournaments, professional wargaming, and hopefully have a lot of simulation assets there on display again for those that haven't seen them. The mobile wets, the vehicle simulators, and we got heaps of stuff there at our last big event, and we're hoping to recreate that. So not only is this a bit of good fun for those that are interested in this sort of thing, there's a lot to learn and to investigate for those that are interested in pursuing wargaming as another training tool. Anyone that does want further info, we usually put out defgrams and stuff like that, but we do have our own website. It's literally adfwga.com, and you can actually access that from the DPN as well. We had it all unblocked for further info. If anyone does want to chat about the recreational side of things more, happy to have a chat after the presentation.
So I went to a previous one that was run in Canberra. It was really very good. It was excellent. So annual Connections conferences, there is a series of conferences, one in the US, one in the UK, the one here in Australia. There's one in the Netherlands where professional, like-minded wargamers run a 3-day seminar. There are a lot of products on their respective websites. The links are in the end of this slide deck. And then finally, DSTG. So DSTG does have a wargaming component within it. They are invaluable. You can reach out to them. They've got data sets. They've got subject matter experts, and they do wargaming for experimental purposes. All right, but that's another resource that is available to us and is probably underutilised by wider Army. So some suggested reading. There's lots of books out there. This is just a small collection. I would definitely recommend you read Professor Sabin's Simulating War. It's a great read, and it's got games in it, a couple of which are on display. Peter Perler's book, a bit old now, but still probably one of the classic books that it is a little dry, but it is also excellent. There is the UK Wargaming Handbook, the doctrine that I spoke about. There's the old hobby gamer stuff. Just a quick example from Don Featherston, who passed away last year, unfortunately, who's considered the father of wargaming in the United Kingdom for hobby gaming. There's old versions of serious wargaming rules, which I have got copies of outside, including the wargame Dun Kempf, which was used by the US Army through the 80s and to the late 70s, 80s, early 90s. Matrix Gaming, Red Teaming Guide, that's also available on the net, and the US Naval War College Wargamers Handbook. So there's plenty of resources out there if you know where to look. If you don't, let me know and I can point you in the right direction. So there are all the resources. I would definitely recommend, or I do recommend, the Connections UK site in particular, but all the Connection sites are excellent. The LBS Consultancy Successful Professional Wargames site is also excellent. The PAX Sims site has got some really good articles in there about wargaming. If you're looking for wargame rules, the History of Wargaming project, you can purchase old wargaming rules for about $20 and they come through the mail. The gentleman that's running that is basically trying to get a collection of all wargaming rules that have ever been written. That's his challenge. Board Game Geek, again, if you want reviews of particular board games, that's there, and Consim World, again, another very useful resource on the web. So outside, there are a number of examples. We'll be out there. You can ask us questions, have a look before you head off. If you are interested, there is a take-home pack which has got a number of these games that are on display out there, which I printed off, which you can take and play and ponder in your own time. So that wraps up the session. All right, thank you very much for your attention. I appreciate you coming.